Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are taking a look at the most WTF thing people have seen in real life. Please be advised that some of these stories contain graphic details and references to death. Viewer discretion is advised. My parents live on a lake, but we have a large patio and grassy area before the yard gives way to the beach. In short, the lake is pretty far from the house. I'm reading upstairs in my room one afternoon and hear a loud thwack. I look over and see a large wet smear on my window. I cross over to the sill and look down, and on the roof below my window, the second story is set back, there is a fish. Now, our lake does not have flying fish, nor does this fish seem to have any appendages that would suggest it could get itself airborne. And while I've seen fish jump plenty of times, no way could one of them have jumped so high or so far as to hit my window. It was a serious WTF moment for me, but when I ran downstairs to tell my dad, he said some fishing bird had probably dropped it. He reminded me how we'd seen eagles have a mid-air fight over a fish, maybe it was lost in a scuffle? So the whole thing got less interesting at that point, but I still laughed to imagine myself at the window, staring at the fish and the lake, then back at the fish, with a look of total bafflement on my face. Me and a friend were driving home one night, and we were passing a Food Lion when we both happened to look at the same star in the sky at the same exact time. This star looked like the most regular star you could fathom. It was just chilling in the sky as a star. Next thing we know, not 2 seconds after looking at this thing, it darts straight to the ground in the blink of an eye. Insane speed. Straight down. We both looked at each other with a "did you see that?" expression, soon realizing what we had really just seen. With how high this thing was and with how fast it dove to the ground, there's no way it was being manned by a human. Who can say for unmanned experimental government aircraft? But what I saw was convincingly alien-like. Start this off by saying I didn't quite see it but experienced it, if that makes sense. When I was 15 years old, I was out visiting some friends in the neighborhood, close to 8 to 9 p.m., so it was already quite dark outside. I lived in a rural part of Canada, where the houses are quite far apart and the neighborhood could be pretty big. Typical evening, I hear some kids screaming and playing on a Tarzan rope just out of sight. I hear a blood-curdling scream and a cry for help, which is not all that unusual since kids fall off the rope and scrape, cut, bruise, sprain, and break all kinds of stuff. You get the idea, I'm sure. So I simply call out, "Shut up, it's late, we are all tired." The screaming continued for quite a while before quieting down. I later found out a kid had strangled himself on the Tarzan rope that night, and I was either screaming at the kid himself or his attempted rescuer. If only I had helped, since I was trained in first aid. It haunts me to this day. I once watched a car drive through a parade of people. In Damascus, Virginia, there is a festival every year where past and present thru-hikers of the Appalachian Trail, people who hike 2,000 plus miles from Georgia to Maine on the Appalachian Trail, and other outdoor enthusiasts go to celebrate the outdoors and the Appalachian Trail. Every year they have a parade where the thru-hikers march down Main Street and get hosed by water guns and pelted with water balloons. We are smelly hiker trash and need a good shower anyway. This year, a car drove through that parade. I was in the middle of the parade with my trail family, dressed in my rain gear, a water-resistant jacket, and a rain kilt. I was pretty buzzed for how early in the day it was. Give me a break. I was celebrating. After only a few minutes, shouts started coming from the back of the parade, followed by loud thuds. I turned around and then heard someone yell, "Get the fuck out of the way." I saw the car, people riding on the hood, others getting hit, and people going under the car. As it came by, I ran to the back driver's side door, opened it up, and jumped in the back seat. I started yelling at the driver to stop. The lights were on, but no one was home. I pulled the e-brake. Another hiker was able to get in the front seat and grab the keys before I got to the e-brake. He was the real hero. He fell out of the car though. A volunteer firefighter jumped in the front passenger seat and started yelling at me to give him the keys, which I didn't have, so he could back it up, which was stupid because hikers were pinned under the car. Seconds after the car stopped, someone from the crowd yelled, "We gotta lift it." I jumped out of the car so I wouldn't add to the weight. By the time I turned around to help lift it, all 4 wheels were off the ground, and so many people were around it that I couldn't find a place to put my hands. The girls underneath the car were dragged out, and the car stayed in the air 30 seconds longer than it had to because the people lifting it didn't know what was happening under the car. No one died, and later that night I danced around a fire naked. I'm a photographer. One day I was out shooting commercial real estate in the city, and after leaving a building, I saw a homeless man dead face down on the street. A crowd surrounded him, and a bunch of people, including myself, checked for a pulse, nothing. It took the ambulance about 20 minutes to show up because of traffic and road closures. They put him on a stretcher and pumped his chest for what I would guess was 15 to 30 minutes. I walked away, thinking it was hopeless, and then realized that my next commercial space was in the same direction as this incident. I realized I was walking the wrong way, and I turned around and went back through the scene. The guy and ambulance were gone, but the crowd of people remained. I asked them what happened, and the general consensus I received was, I don't know how, but they brought this guy back. He woke up, looked at us all, and said something under his breath. I thought he was dead, for sure. Kind of WTF with a little bit of miracle thrown in. My girlfriend and I had gotten lunch by her work, and we were walking back to her office. A man was walking on the sidewalk towards us, and he looked relatively normal. When we were maybe 10 feet away, he stopped, pointed at us, and began laughing maniacally while slapping himself in the face as hard as he could. He didn't touch us or move towards us at all, he just stared us in the eyes as we walked by. It would have been less disturbing, I think, if he tried to hurt one of us. That would have been a predictable interaction, at least in the sense of this person wants to hurt me, I need to protect myself. But we were being subjected to this odd display. The pointing and laughing is such an aggressive thing, which, when combined with slapping himself in the face, makes you feel like you're the butt of a joke you'll never understand. He holds this sick power over you. My girlfriend was laughing out of confusion, and I felt almost nauseous. His eyes were looking at us, but he was gone. He was hitting himself so hard that the skin on his face was shifting, and yet he wasn't even blinking. When we passed, he stopped and kept walking. Further on his way, he saw a man walking to his car parked on the street. This nutbag walked right up to him and began laughing and pointing again. We were about a half block away and could hear his hand hitting his face. He even switched hands a couple times. It was just so strange. He lived somewhere and left his house that day with who knows what was going on in his head. Whatever it is makes him slap his own face in front of every person he comes across. There was a group of kids across the street, and I was terrified they would see him. Luckily, they didn't. It scares me to imagine what that interaction would have been like. I was staying with my sister in Vielsk, Germany, on the US military base for a few weeks. Her, my mom, and I decided to go to Nuremberg for a few days. Since we were going to be there for a few days, we got a hotel. This particular hotel was right by the subway station. At about 2 in the morning, I decide to go have a cigarette and walk down to the station as I'm smoking to see the graffiti. Side note, German graffiti kicks ass. After I got done looking at the graffiti, I sat at the bottom of the staircase. A neo-Nazi walked by. I avoided speaking to him and even looking at him because his swastika armband and shaved head disgusted me. About 4 more Germans walked around the other corner, saw him, and proceeded to beat the hell out of him. I'm talking blood everywhere, broken nose, broken arm, broken ribs, broken leg, black eyes, busted lips, just brutal. I vividly remember this incident whenever graffiti, Nuremberg, or Nazism come up in discussion. Spring break in my junior year of college, we arrived at our hotel in Panama City Beach around 4 a.m. but weren't allowed to check in until 2 p.m. Luckily, some of our friends had gotten there the day before, so we went to their rooms, attempted to rally everybody that was still up, and started drinking pretty heavily. At around 8 a.m., we were smoking a blunt on the 10th floor balcony overlooking the strip when we started to hear a car engine getting louder and louder. My buddy standing up leans forward to see what's going on and says, "What the fuck, y'all get up and see this." At which point I stood and fixed my eyes on a small, yellow car fast approaching us, swerving into oncoming traffic and sideswiping parked cars along the street. As the car sped in front of us, I caught a glimpse of the driver, who appeared out of his mind as his hands were above his head, possessing a terrifying look on his face. Immediately past our hotel was an entrance to a parking garage. I'm not exactly sure what happened inside the vehicle as the car started sliding, seemingly in an attempt to pull into the garage, but I assume somebody pulled the emergency brake. The result was missing the driveway by several feet and instead ramping 10 feet up a curb or small hill that elevated the sidewalk into a palm tree. For example, rather than hitting the tree head on, the car's bottom made contact, which bent the tree, causing it to suddenly snap in half, and was slung shot onto the road, landing upside down on the roof, rolling, and sliding down the state. One person was ejected in mid-air, and another slowly drug his way through the broken glass out of the car. I believe he had a glass jar of weed, and possibly mushrooms, in his possession. 10 to 15 people on ground level rushed to the scene, where a pool of blood quickly grows around the car. They helped one other person out of the wreckage, but the driver was not pulled from the car until the jaws of life came out, after his life had ended. I heard later that the person ejected in flight was the only survivor, but I wasn't able to confirm that with any news articles. All I know for sure is that these kids were in the same position as my group, who arrived early in the morning and were turned away at check-in. Imagine the phone call that had to be made to the victims' parents one day after their children had left for spring break. I was about 12, and I was in the backyard when my younger sister came and got me. She couldn't communicate what was wrong, but when I followed her down the alley to the street, I saw a couple of girls on big wheels taking turns coasting down their driveway into the street. When they got to the bottom and rolled into the street, cars would screech to a stop, and the drivers would honk and yell. I ran to the driveway and stood there, blocking them and yelling for them to stop as they yelled at me to get out of the way. Eventually their mother came out and yelled for them to stop, but they yelled back, she looked confused, and they went back inside. I told my sister to run and get my mom, and she did, but when mom showed up, the girls and I both began yelling at the same time, and there was no way to hear what either were saying. My mom told me to come home now, and I started yelling that they were going to get killed, but the girls were yelling too. Eventually, my mom grabbed me by the hair and dragged me painfully out of the way. One girl went down the driveway right in front of a semi, which dragged her down the road, leaving a long red streak. I didn't actually see her hit by the semi, but only saw the reactions of everybody who did. I'm not sure if my mom understood why it had happened. The truck driver was sobbing when he found out what he had hit. He apparently had 2 children of his own. The fire department had to come and hose away the fire. About 15 years ago, there was a big, outdoor event at my church. My friend Stuart had brought along his video camera. As things were getting ready to start, I noticed Stuart was filming the sky. He told me to come over and look. There was something black up in the sky. At first, I thought it was a hot air balloon, but when I zoomed in, I could see that it was a perfect sphere, not the inverted teardrop shape of a balloon. And it was changing directions, moving back and forth in a slow zigzag pattern, which meant it couldn't be something just drifting along with the wind. After about 5 minutes, it floated up too high to see. We took turns watching for a couple of hours, but it never returned. To this day, I have no idea what it was. I was in Boston the night they won the World Series in 2004. I partied all night and saw many amazing and memorable things. We were trying to get a taxi back to the hotel for hours. The cab companies were just unable to keep up with the demand. It's now 3 a.m., and we are sitting on a bench on some street, just clueless about how we are going to get to the hotel. I look across the street, and there's a pretty large crowd. All of a sudden, a brawl breaks out. Like a 15-on-15 street brawl. I take my eyes off the gang brawl and look to my left. There's a guy in a full Chewbacca costume. Like a really realistic one straight from the movies. He's all by himself. We look at each other and nod. That was the biggest WTF moment of my life. When I was about 17, I had to drive a child to the hospital who had just cut his neck with a fish tank. He had climbed the shelf, and it shattered and sliced his neck. The owner held pressure on his neck, and we rushed him to the hospital. I was closest to the van, and it was quicker to rush to the hospital than wait for an ambulance. He was slipping out of consciousness, and she was tapping his face and yelling at him to stay awake. I'm not sure if he sliced his jugular or not, but it was bad. I'll never forget his face. He ended up okay, and I believe he lost a little mobility in his arm, but okay nonetheless. I was 18 and working on my car in my driveway. It was a gorgeous day out, and I just pulled my floor jack out to do some suspension work. I hear kids playing, lawnmowers, and chainsaws. It's totally normal for the weather. Then, out of nowhere, I hear a large tree falling. It started. I hear cries and screams for help and ask God why. I didn't know what happened, but it was obviously bad. I ran inside and told my mom to send the police towards the intersection. The screaming stemmed from here. I run immediately to a house a few down the road and see the worst sight I'll never forget. A tree fell the wrong way and crushed a 14-year-old boy. I folded the poor boy in half. His head was embedded in the ground, right between his ankles. Everyone tried to lift it off, but to no avail. It felt like time froze. I'd never seen someone die. Then poof. I had a great idea. I ran back to my house, retrieved my floor jack, damn good thing it was aluminum, and ran back to the house. I shoved the jack under the tree as the poor boy breathed in pain, unable to form a word. I managed to get the tree just high enough to get him out. We straightened him out and tried to help him breathe. The ambulance arrived. The boy was hanging onto a thread when they drove him off. I had never met these people in all my life. They were all crying and thanking me, and honestly, I don't even remember doing it. It was instinct. I never saw the boy again. They were soon evicted, but I managed to ask one of his parents if he survived. He did, barely. Many crushed bones and flattened organs. They credit me with saving him, but I'm not sure he would thank me. I'll never forget. I couldn't sleep right for a month. All I could see was this poor boy's face, purple from near suffocation. His eyes nearly popped straight from his head. Blood is coming from his tear ducts. I wish I could have done more. When I lived in South Africa, I traveled a lot with a Christian missionary or humanitarian aid worker. He handled the spiritual stuff, and I tended to work more with the local, mostly Xhosa, people, helping them with non-spiritual issues. In July 2010, we went to a village in the middle of nowhere. As soon as we stepped out of the truck, we knew something was wrong. We hadn't been able to contact our guy in the village all day, and there was no one around at all. Pete and I went from house to house, looking for, well, anyone, but everywhere was completely empty. Eventually, we saw a figure run around the corner of a building on the far side of the village. It was a young woman, stark naked, running straight for us. Her arms were flailing, and she was running like an animal, occasionally dropping to all fours, then back on her feet. As she got closer, Pete told me to get back in the truck, and then he screamed at me to get in the truck.
I'd seen this guy watch a Xhosa witch doctor burn a dozen chickens alive and not bat an eyelid, so when he lost his SHT, I knew it was serious.
I closed the truck door as she reached us. She was covered in blood, there were cuts and slices all over her body, one of her ears was missing, I think there was a lot of blood, her teeth were bloody, and she had a look in her eye of absolute, untamed rage. The screeching sound she made is unlike anything I've heard before or since. I can still hear it so vividly in my mind. Looking into her face and seeing her wide psychotic eyes and gaping mouth as she made that unholy sound froze me in my seat. Pete had started the truck and already started reversing up the dirt track, but she followed. He turned the car, all the while she was scratching at the windows and metalwork, then sped off up the track. She followed us. She didn't keep up, obviously, but for a while I thought she was going to. I've never seen someone run that fast on bare feet. The journey back to our base town was almost silent. I spent most of it concentrating on the sound of my own breathing and the rumble of the road. I asked Pete what that was and what we should do. He said the girl was no doubt insane, had a psychotic break, or something, but the locals would have immediately thought she was possessed. If she didn't kill herself, the other villagers would within days. He suggested they had gathered in one house for safety. I saw a lot of fucked up shit in that country. When I was about 9 years old, I was snowboarding on a small mountain in New England with my brother, a friend, and my dad. The sun had set, and dusk was coming to an end. We had been at it all day, but I had just learned how to carve from one edge to the other after hours of falling on my ass, so I was really excited and wanted to keep practicing my new skills. We were going up the ski lift but had gotten separated in line. The lift chairs only held 2 people at a time. My dad went up by himself, my brother and friend were next, and I was in the chair behind them. The climb is slow, and I'm idly watching the people ski down the slope. There's a distant, yet shrill, scream, and at the top of the ridge, I see a female skier gaining speed, clearly out of control. I see my friend and brother point to her and clearly notice her too. We always like to laugh at people when they fell, and at first I was getting excited for the inevitable show, but I quickly realized that this time it wouldn't be so funny. She is really picking up speed and screaming loudly. Shearing terror filled the air as she careened down the mountain. Right underneath where I was on the lift, the trail veered right, and there was a thick set of trees. She's heading right for them. As I pass over the first trees, she flies right under me and nails one. I hear a loud, hollow crack, as if someone had hurled a melon at a wooden floor. I'm stunned as the horrible sound echoes in my brain. Everyone on the hill had stopped skiing, and for a moment, all was still except the squeaking of the lift. Then my dad's voice booms out from the chairs ahead of me, screaming for help. A number of people on the lift picked up the cry. By the time we reach the top and ride down to the collision, ski patrol is already there and has roped off the area. The girl was rushed to the hospital. She had split her head open and was in critical condition. She slipped into a coma for a few months. Unfortunately, she passed away from her injuries. It was pretty scary to witness someone die like that, right under my feet. It was probably the funniest and, at the same time, most hard-hitting moment of my life. I've been a part-time firefighter in the UK for about a year now and went to my first big automobile accident 6 months ago. When I turned up in the truck, the ambulance and police still hadn't arrived, but another fire engine had already turned up and started preparing for the other services to get there. When I jumped out, a senior fire officer walked over to me and said, "Whatever you do, do not laugh, the driver is in serious pain and the passenger is dead. When I got to what was left of the small car, a Nissan Micra, if you're interested, I didn't know whether to break down and cry or to laugh until I shit my pants. The small car had drifted from the outside lane and into the hard shoulder where an Arctic truck had been resting up. I poked my head into the driver's side window and saw the driver had managed to ram his head all the way through the bars of the steering wheel, a gap about half the width of his head, a pretty much impossible feat, and was stuck like it. The passenger had a white sheet over their body, so I couldn't see how fatal it had been for him yet. I stepped back and walked over to another firefighter smoking a cigarette and standing next to an upturned bucket about 30 meters down the road. I made a sort of exasperated face that hopefully read, "Well, what the fuck?" And he turns to me and says, "You think that's crazy? The passenger's head is under this bucket." Apparently, the force of the little toy car impacting with the back of the stationary truck forced the driver's head through the steering wheel. His neck turned out to be completely shattered, lucky he could breathe at all, and the back forks of the truck had totally decapitated the passenger, and he launched his head about a fifth of a mile down the motorway, through the windscreen. I know it's awful to feel the need to laugh at the situation, but at the time, I thought it was such a stressful and shocking moment that I didn't know how to react. Officers often say that when you view something so powerful, the shock causes you to react in a way that you can handle at that moment, and the fear or appropriate reaction often only hits you much later.